Hello everyone, and welcome to the 12th video of the Angular Portfolio website course. In this video, we will be adding a modal for our projects. For those who may not know, a modal is a pop-up window that overlays on a site. And if we take a look at the finished site, we will be using a modal to display more detailed information about any given project. We will also be covering how to implement a carousel, which is the picture slideshow here, and that will allow us to have a visual aid to go with our projects. Before we get started, let's take a look at the documentation for NGX Bootstrap. NGX Bootstrap provides us with a series of components that we can use in our website. This is what we will be using to implement our modal, as well as a few other components later on. Let's click on the modal tile. This will show us more information about the modal's component. If we click on API, we will see the installation steps that are needed to use this component. Most, if not all, NGX Bootstrap components will require you to import their module within the imports array that's located inside of our app.module file. Let's go do that now. Go ahead and open your project. Then, find the app.module file and open it. Within our imports array, let's add a new line. Then, let's type modal module dot for root. We're now seeing an error because we haven't imported that module yet. So at the top, let's type import modal module from NGX Bootstrap modal. Now that we have installed the modal module, we can start implementing the modal itself. Go ahead and open up the project card component. We want the modal to be displayed when we click on the View More button that exists within the project card component. Because of this, our modal will be implemented within the project card component. At the top, let's declare a variable called bs_modal_ref, which is of the type bs_modal_ref. This variable will serve as a reference to our modal. We will need to import the bs_modal_ref manually. Also, make sure that you have included this question mark. This designates our modal as optional. This is necessary because our modal won't always be initialized. The next thing we will need is the bs_modal service. Let's inject that into our component by going into our constructor and typing private modal service bs_modal service. We will need to manually import the bs_modal service as well. This service is provided to us by NGX Bootstrap, and this service is what gives us the functionality to open and close our modal. Next, let's create a method that will handle opening the modal. Down here, let's type open project modal. In the body of this method, let's type this dot bs_modal_ref equals this dot modal service dot show. It's going to throw an error because it's expecting a few parameters. For now, let's pass in a pair of empty quotes. Our modal is almost created. The last step is to assign this method to our view button's click event. Let's go to our HTML template. Let's access our view button's click event by typing click. Let's set it equal to our method by typing open project modal. Let's go to our site and test this out. Let's click on View More to see if a modal pops up. The screen darkened as it's supposed to, so it's somewhat working, but we're not seeing a modal yet. This is because our modal service is expecting us to pass in an HTML template, and so far we have only passed in empty quotes. Let's go back to our project. The modal service.show method is expecting an HTML template. We're going to solve this by creating a new Angular component to represent our modal. And the HTML template for that new component is what we will use to set the styling and contents of our modal. In our terminal, open a new session if needed. Then we'll type ng gc project modal, skip tests, and press enter. In our new component, let's inject a BS modal ref into our constructor by typing public BS modal ref colon BS modal ref. This injection is a prerequisite that's needed when we want to use an Angular component as a modal. Let's go back to our project card component. Let's pass in our project modal component into the show method. Remove the quotes and then type project modal component. If it auto-suggests the component, then pressing enter will also import it at the top. Let's go back to our site and test this out. Upon pressing the View button, we now see a modal that is using our new component's HTML template, which currently just contains the default placeholder text. If we take a look at the finished site, this is what we're aiming for. The first thing we will need to do is make our modal wider to accommodate all of this information. Let's go back to our project. So at this point you may be wondering, how do we set the styling for our modal? To answer that, we will first need to create a variable of type modal options. In our open project modal method, add a few lines and then type const modal options colon modal options equals empty braces. Modal options is a class that lets us define a set of initial properties for our modal. These properties can include things like input data, and in our case, we can set any CSS classes that we want to use to style our modal. Inside of these curly braces, type class colon empty quotes, and inside of these quotes, let's type modal dash LG. This is a bootstrap class that will make our modal wider. Next, let's pass our modal options as a second parameter to the show method. Let's take a look at our site again. As you can see, the modal is wider now, so it is applying the class that we set in our modal options. If we take a look at the finished site again, we see that our modal is using project-specific data, which indicates that we will need to pass in our project data as an input to our modal. Let's go back to our project. Open up the project modal component. In here, let's declare a variable called project, which is of type project. Then let's go back to our project card component. The project that we get as an input into this component will be passed along into our modal. That's how we will get project-specific data into our modal for each different project card. In our modal options, we are going to set another property called initial state. This property is what allows us to initialize properties of our modal component, such as the project variable that we just declared. In this initial state property, let's set the project variable of our modal equal to this.project. What this is doing is it's taking the project input for our project card component and passing it along into the modal. Now that we're passing in the project data, we can start styling our modal. Let's go to the modal's HTML template. Let's remove the placeholder text and replace it with a div that has the class modal header. As the class name implies, this div will serve as our modal header. Inside of our header, let's add an h2 tag, which will contain our project name. Let's also add a button with the class of button close. This button is going to be used to close out the modal. However, in order for that to work, we need to assign some sort of method to our button's click event. In this case, we don't need to create a new method or anything, since the BS modal ref that we're injecting already has a method that will close out of our modal. Let's set our button's click event equal to BS modal ref.hide. Let's test this out on our site. The modal now has the name of the project we clicked on. In this case, it's Sample Angular App. We also have our button on the right-hand side that we can use to close out of our modal. If we take a look at the finished modal, the next step is to add a carousel. However, like the modal, this is an NGX Bootstrap component that needs to be installed into our project. So let's do that now. Open up app.module. In the import section, add a new line and then type carousel module.forRoot. Then at the top, add this import statement for the carousel. Let's go back to our modal's HTML template. The carousel will be a part of the body of our modal. So let's add another div below our header. And let's give it the class of modal body. Inside of this div, we can add a carousel by adding a carousel element. We have now created our carousel, but we still need to give it slides. We can do this by adding slide elements. These slides won't display anything yet. This is because we still need to set up a picture for each of our slides. I have added 3 pictures into my assets folder that I will use to represent project images. Since these projects aren't real, these pictures are also just placeholders and don't represent anything significant. However, they will work fine for demonstration purposes. I will include links to these in the description, or you can alternatively use images of your own projects, but that will be up to you. Going back to our project modal, we're going to add an image to each of our slides. In the first slide, let's add an image element. The source will point to one of our images, so let's type the path to the first image. This is the relative path from this component to the assets folder. As long as your project is structured the same, this same path should work for you. Let's do this again for the remaining 2 slides. For each of these slides, let's set the alt text to slide. And let's also set the style of our slides to display block. And width 100%. Let's see what this looks like. We now have a functioning carousel. At the moment, we hard-coded the slides and their images. Let's go back to our project and see how we can display different images for each of our projects. Let's go back to our project service and take a look at our project data. Our project model contains a pictures array that we are not using yet. This array is where we're going to store our relative paths for the images we want to use in our assets folder. I'm going to take the relative paths we used and store them in the first array now. This first project's pictures array now contains the relative paths for those images and can reference them for the carousel. At this point, I'm going to use these same 3 images for the rest of the projects as well. In a real setting, you would have a different set of images for each project and use their relative paths accordingly. However, since these are all just made up projects, I'm not going to create unique images for each one. Just keep in mind for yourself, you may want to create subfolders for each project's images. Let's go back to our Modal's HTML template. Let's remove our hard-coded slides and replace it by looping over our project's images. First, let's create an empty div. And inside this div, let's create a for loop that loops over our project's pictures array. Let's copy our first slide into our for loop. And since our picture element holds the relative path for our images, we will just set the source equal to picture. We can now get rid of the other slides. Let's check our site to make sure everything is still working properly. Our carousel is still presenting the images. It's just now creating them by looping over the pictures array of any given project. Now we need to fill out the rest of our modal, so let's go back to our project. Next, we're going to add in the project description. So within our modal body, let's add a few spaces. And then add an h3 tag with the class margin top 2. Inside of this tag, we'll type description. Below this, we'll add a paragraph tag that contains the project description. Then underneath this, we're going to add another paragraph tag. Inside of here, let's add the text. You can find this project on GitHub. While still inside this paragraph tag, we're going to add a link, so let's add a nested A tag. Let's set the href attribute to point to the project's link. Then let's add the word here inside of the A tag. The idea behind this last part here is that we can display our project link that can point to an external site. In this case, these are all software engineering projects, so it would make sense to include a link to the repository on GitHub. Of course, if your project repositories are not on GitHub, or if your projects aren't code-based at all, then I encourage you to customize this last part to something that would make sense for your projects. For this link, let's also add target equals blank, which will cause our link to be opened in a new tab. We're almost done setting up our modal. The last part will be displaying our project tags at the bottom of the modal. Let's start by adding a divider. Next, let's create a div that has the classes dflex and flexWrap. Inside of this, let's add a nested div that loops on our project tags. We can actually just grab what we already have in the project card template. Go ahead and copy the div that's looping on our project tags. Then we'll come back to our modal and paste that inside of our div. That should cover everything for our modal's HTML template. There's one last thing we still need to take care of before we test our modal. Right now, we're trying to assign the tag class to this innermost div. However, the tag class has only been defined inside of the project card style sheet. Since we're going to be referencing this tag class across a few different components, it makes sense to move this into our global style sheet, so let's do that now. The tag class is now accessible to any component in our project. Let's go ahead and take a look at our modal. We now have the project description, tags, and the project link. If I click on it, it'll take us to a new window. Since these aren't real projects, the link just takes us to GitHub's landing page. However, for yourself, I encourage you to customize that link for each of your projects, or possibly remove it if it's not applicable. If we take a look at our homepage, we now have everything we need to finish building out the featured project tile. Let's take care of that now. Let's open up our homepage template. The featured project tile is essentially going to be a condensed down version of our project modal. Let's give ourselves a little bit of room to work with. We're going to add the same exact carousel here. And to make it easy on ourselves, let's copy the carousel code from the modal and bring it here. We're getting an error here because we should be using our component variable featured project instead. So let's fix that now. Below our carousel, let's add a paragraph that contains the project summary. Make sure it has the class margin top 2. And below that, let's add another paragraph element. Inside of here, let's type visit the portfolio section to learn more. That should be all that's needed. Let's check it out on our site. The featured project tile is now complete and gives a brief overview of the project while prompting the user to check out the full details in the portfolio section of our site. This should have been the stopping point for this video, but I realized I made a small mistake. If we navigate to the portfolio section, some of the projects have an extra period at the end of their summary. This means I forgot to remove a period somewhere. Let's go back to the project and fix this really quick. Then let's open up the project card's HTML template. And let's remove this extra period after the project summary. Then let's go back to our site. Our summaries now only have one period, and that wraps up this video. Feel free to continue along to the next video, in which we will add filtering to our portfolio page. If you're liking the course so far, please consider subscribing to the channel. This helps the channel grow so I can continue to create tutorials like this. Thanks for watching.